By hour 2, the untrained person has already made the 3 decisions that will kill them. Not later, not eventually. By hour 2, when adrenaline drops, when the situation is no longer abstract, when the body starts asking questions the mind has no answers for, the gap between surviving and not surviving is almost never about gear. It is almost never about physical strength. It is almost always about a small cluster of cognitive and physical competencies that take less than an afternoon to learn and a lifetime of not knowing to regret. Most people will never close that gap. Not because they lack time, because they have been told, repeatedly and incorrectly, that survival is a discipline for specialists. It is not. There are 7 skills. Each one is learnable today. Each one has a documented record of keeping people alive when everything else failed. And this is what they are and exactly how to build them before the sun goes down. FEMA's own post-incident analyses of major domestic disasters, Hurricane Katrina, the 2011 Joplin tornado, the 2018 Camp Fire, consistently identify the same variable. Civilian survival outcomes in the first 72 hours correlate not with equipment owned but with prior behavioral rehearsal of basic competencies. The Red Cross puts the critical window at 72 hours before infrastructure response becomes statistically reliable. Within that window, the decisions made in the first 2 to 4 hours carry the highest consequence weight. The skills in this video target that window specifically. Nothing here is theoretical. Everything here has a documented application record. Nora was 11 miles from her car when the temperature dropped 14 degrees in 40 minutes. And the only thing that stood between her and stage 2 hypothermia was a piece of knowledge she had read once and almost forgotten. Thermal regulation without gear is not about warmth. It is about the body's heat loss hierarchy. You lose heat through 6 primary mechanisms: conduction, convection, radiation, evaporation, respiration, and wet contact. And most people in an emergency might address none of them correctly because they address the one that feels most urgent rather than the one causing the most damage. Wind matters more than cold in most temperate emergencies. Wet clothing against skin is the single fastest driver of core temperature loss at moderate temperatures. The mechanism is simple. Water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air at the same temperature. That number is not an approximation. It is the documented thermal conductivity differential, and it explains why exposure deaths occur at 50 degrees Fahrenheit more often than at 20. In recorded wilderness fatality cases, the majority of hypothermia deaths occur in temperatures above freezing. Nora remembered this. She stopped moving. She found a wind block. She removed her wet base layer and insulated her torso with dry material before anything else. Stop the heat loss before you generate new heat, and create a wind barrier using any available material before seeking warmth. Remove wet layers from core contact even if the air feels cold. Insulate the ground beneath you before the walls around you. The body loses heat downward faster than outward. That single inversion of priority has saved lives that no amount of fire-starting skill could have reached in time. The default human assumption about water is that visible clarity equals safety. It does not. Tariq's family spent 3 days at a campsite in the San Gabriel Mountains after a flash flood destroyed the access road in 2019. And by day 2, they were pulling water from a stream that looked clean and tasted clean and would have made all 4 of them critically ill within hours if Tariq's father had not known one functional skill. Water treatment without commercial filters is a solved problem. It has been a solved problem for over a century. Rolling boil, defined as 1 full minute of vigorous boiling at elevations below 6,500 feet 3 minutes above, kills every documented waterborne pathogen of concern in a survival scenario: Giardia, Cryptosporidium, bacterial coliforms, and viral agents. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has published this guidance consistently since the 1990s. The failure mode is not ignorance of the method. It is ignorance of the elevation modifier and the tendency to undershoot the boil duration under stress. A visible simmer is not a rolling boil. 60 seconds of observation is not a guess. Learn to identify a true rolling boil by sight before you need to. Understand the elevation threshold and know which side of it you are on in your most likely emergency geography. If boiling is impossible, unscented household chlorine bleach at 6 to 8% concentration, 8 drops per gallon of clear water, 16 for cloudy, produces potable water in 30 minutes. Carry nothing. Know the method. The method is the equipment. Tariq didn't die from the accident. He died 4 minutes later in the parking lot, while 3 people stood next to him and didn't know what to do with their hands. Uncontrolled hemorrhage is the leading cause of preventable death in trauma scenarios. The U.S. military identified this in post-combat analysis following operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it produced the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Program, the core of which was later adapted for civilian use as Stop the Bleed, a public training initiative launched by the American College of Surgeons in 2015. The finding that drove both programs was the same. Most trauma deaths from extremity wounds occur within 3 to 5 minutes of injury, and most of those deaths are preventable with manual intervention that requires no medical training to execute. The technique is wound packing, filling a deep wound cavity with clean material and applying sustained direct pressure for a minimum of 3 uninterrupted minutes. Not approximate pressure, sustained body weight pressure. The physics are simple. You are manually occluding the vessel until clotting begins. Releasing pressure to check the wound resets the clock. Practice the motion now, on a dry surface, with a rolled cloth. Learn the difference between surface pressure and cavity packing. 3 minutes of uninterrupted pressure is longer than it feels in a calm room and much longer than it feels under stress. Time it once. Know where your brachial, femoral, and radial pressure points are before you need them. A person with this knowledge sitting next to an injured stranger is more valuable than an ambulance that is 6 minutes away. That is not a metaphor. That is documented response time arithmetic. The modern assumption is that navigation is a phone function. It is not a skill. It is a dependency. When Marcus Ellison's vehicle left the road in a remote stretch of eastern Oregon during a February ice storm in 2017, his phone showed him exactly where he was until the battery died 40 minutes later. Then it showed him nothing. True navigation, the kind that works when the infrastructure fails, operates on 2 inputs that are always available in daylight: the sun's arc and terrain logic. The sun rises in the eastern quadrant and sets in the western quadrant in every location on Earth. At solar noon, the moment of highest sun position, a shadow cast by a vertical object points true north in the northern hemisphere and true south in the southern hemisphere. This is not folklore. It is the geometric consequence of Earth's axial tilt and orbital position, and it has been used for navigation since before written record. The watch method, aligning the hour hand toward the sun and bisecting the angle between the hour hand and 12 o'clock, it provides a cardinal direction estimate accurate to within 15 degrees in most temperate latitudes. 15 degrees of error over a 1-mile walk produces a displacement of approximately 460 feet. That is correctable. Complete disorientation is not. Practice the watch method 3 times in a familiar area before you need it. Learn to read terrain drainage. Water flows downhill, and downhill leads to larger water, and larger water leads to human infrastructure in the vast majority of inhabited geographies. Movement is not always survival. Knowing which direction to move is. Stop. Consider what all 4 of those skills share. Each one works on a body that has nothing in its pockets. Each one requires no purchase, no subscription, no prior credential. Each one fails at exactly the same point. The moment the person executing it has never rehearsed the motion before. The real question is not whether you know these skills exist. Most people reading a survival list know these skills exist. The question is why nearly every formal survival curriculum spends 60% of its instructional time on fire starting and shelter building, 2 skills with the longest lead time to application, while spending almost nothing on hemorrhage control and thermal physics, the two competency gaps with the highest documented mortality correlation in the first 4 hours of an emergency. The answer is that fire and shelter make for better content. They photograph well. They feel ancient and self-reliant and cinematic. The skills that actually keep people alive in hour 2 of a real emergency are unglamorous, and that bias has costs. Here is what comes next. Fire without a lighter is taught everywhere and practiced almost nowhere. That gap is the problem. The bow drill method, friction-based fire using a spindle, a fireboard, a bow, and a handhold, has been independently developed on every inhabited continent. It is not a primitive technique preserved for nostalgia. It is the technique that works when everything else is gone, and it has a learning curve that most people underestimate by a factor of 3. First-time success rate for the bow drill without prior instruction is below 10%. First-time success rate after 2 hours of structured practice is above 60%. That jump happens in one afternoon. The critical variables are wood pairing, therefore, the spindle and fireboard must be matched in hardness and moisture content and notch geometry, which determines whether the coal forms at all. The notch must be cut to 1/8 of the drill socket circle, no more, positioned, so the tip extends just past center, too small and no coal forms, too large and the coal disperses. Practice the notch cut on scrap wood before you build a full kit. Identify the dry. See soft woods native to your region, as in North America, cottonwood, willow, basswood, and cedar are reliable pairings. Build a complete kit and run it to coal twice in a controlled setting. The first success changes the skill from theoretical to embodied. Embodied is the only version that works under stress. By day 3 of a caloric deficit, the untrained person begins making decisions that feel rational and are not. Hunger is not the danger. Hunger-driven cognition is. The human body can sustain meaningful physical and cognitive function for 72 hours on water alone in a moderate activity scenario. Most survival emergencies resolve within that window. The failure mode is not starvation. It is the decision to expend enormous caloric energy foraging or hunting before the body's reserves are even meaningfully depleted, burning more than is found, accelerating the deficit, and degrading the judgment needed to execute every other skill on this list. The documented principle is caloric triage. Rank available food sources by caloric density per unit of energy expended in acquisition, and do not pursue sources that operate at a net caloric loss. Nuts and seeds are the highest density wild forageable in most North American and European environments. Insects, specifically beetles, ants, and grasshoppers, are the highest density animal-sourced caloric option achievable with near zero pursuit energy. Rodents require trap construction and a waiting period. They are a day 2 resource, not a day 1 resource. Understand your region's 3 highest density forageable species before an emergency occurs. Do not forage anything you cannot identify with certainty. Misidentified plants have killed experienced outdoors people. The caloric value of an uncertain mushroom is never worth the risk. Eat nothing uncertain, drink everything safe. That hierarchy, maintained strictly, it keeps cognition functional long enough for everything else to work. Every documented survivor account from multi-day wilderness emergencies contains the same inflection point. The moment the person stopped improvising and started executing a mental framework they had rehearsed. Survival psychology research, documented extensively by John Leach at the University of Portsmouth and in the U.S., Air Force SERE program records, identifies a consistent behavioral cluster in non-survivors. They experience the emergency as unique, react to it as novel, and exhaust cognitive and physical resources in unstructured response. Survivors do something structurally different. They anchor. Psychological anchoring in a survival context is a pre-rehearsed cognitive sequence, a short, fixed decision tree the mind can execute when executive function is compromised by stress. The sequence does not need to be complex. Stop, breathe, assess, prioritize. 4 steps. Practiced in advance, that sequence interrupts the panic loop before it completes and routes the brain back toward functional decision-making. Leach's research found that approximately 75% of people in a sudden life-threatening event freeze or engage in completely non-adaptive behavior. The remaining 25% are not braver or stronger. They have a preloaded pattern to run. You build yours now. Write a 4-step personal response sequence and rehearse it aloud 3 times today. Attach it to a physical anchor, a breath, a hand motion, a single repeated word, so the body can trigger it before the mind catches up. The anchor is not a comfort mechanism. It is a cognitive interrupt. The difference between those two definitions is the difference between therapy and survival. Thermal regulation without gear is a physics problem with a known solution. Water treatment without equipment is a chemistry problem solved over a century ago. Hemorrhage control is a pressure problem with a 3-minute intervention window. Navigation without technology is a geometry problem the sun solves every day. Fire without a lighter is a materials problem that 2 hours of practice converts from impossible to reliable. Caloric triage is a decision problem that stops hunger from degrading the judgment needed for every other skill. Psychological anchoring is a cognitive problem that separates the 75% from the 25% in the first 90 seconds of an emergency. The person who spends one afternoon on these 7 things arrives at month 3 with embodied competencies they do not have to think about. They execute under stress because they have rehearsed the motion, not the concept. The person who does not spends month 3 relying on infrastructure, on other people, non-luck, 3 variables that real emergencies systematically remove. Practice the bow drill kit to 2 successful coals this week. Memorize the rolling boil threshold for your elevation. Run your psychological anchor sequence aloud before you go to sleep tonight. Learn the wound packing pressure duration by timing it once on your own forearm with a folded cloth. 1 afternoon. 7 competencies. The window is open right now, and it will not stay open forever.